Hello, and welcome to the third podcast on the letter to the Hebrews. In this podcast, we will be considering the end of the second chapter of Hebrews in comparison with the Jewish book of Jubilees. I think everyone may be starting to see a trend behind this study. Not only are we investigating the letter to the Hebrews, but I am also bringing in information on other Jewish scriptures that Jesus, his followers, and the author of Hebrews would have been familiar with. As such, we are learning not only about Hebrews, but Jewish religious expectations for the Messiah at that time. A side note now related to some comments I have received. This is an academic study of Hebrews as a function of late Second Temple Judaism. Excluding the Gentile followers of Paul, most of Jesus' followers at the time were Jewish. I have intentionally refrained from discussing any topics related to later developing Christian dogma or doctrine after 175 of the Common Era. As we have discussed in previous podcasts, in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 10 through 18, the author of Hebrews continues to explain his puzzling claims that in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 4 through 14, and in Hebrews 2, verses 5 through 9, about the elevation of the divine Son of God above the angels. There are real tensions in Hebrews chapter 1 regarding the Son. On the one hand, the Son is the agent and sustainer of all of creation. This is especially seen in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. On the other hand, the Son has also been elevated above the angels. So how can the Son, who existed before creation and through whom God created all things, have been elevated above the angels whom he created? When was the Son ever below the angels, such that his status and position would change? These tensions will find resolution in Hebrews' second chapter, where the author states that the heavenly Son of God became the incarnate human being, Jesus. As a human being, the pre-existent divine Son died, was perfected, and was elevated to the throne of his Father's right hand. This idea is similar to Paul's conception of Jesus, who was a man and an agent of God. But after the resurrection, Jesus gets, quote-unquote, perfected into a semi-divine agent of God's heavenly family. He becomes the Son of Man spoken of in Daniel chapter 7. The author's argument in the second chapter of Hebrews partly relies on his reading of Psalm 8. This psalm indicates that while human beings presently stand a little lower than the angels, God always intended to place the angels under human authority. Thus, the divine Son was made a little lower than the angels by becoming a human being. Jesus is the pre-existent Son of God, who as a human being was made lower than the angels for a time, but has now been elevated above them to the royal throne in the heavens. Thus, the incarnation of the divine Son resolves the tension we find in Hebrews chapter 1. The divine Son's humanity not only means that he is the Son of Man, elevated to God's heavenly throne, it also means that he is able to make his fellow human beings holy as well. I'll now read from Hebrews chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of our salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sacrifices and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers. He does this by representing them before his Father as their incarnate high priest. a theme the author develops much more robustly later in Hebrews chapters 4 through 10. Yet the son's ongoing high priestly work of intercession for his siblings, this is seen in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25, is only one aspect of how he saves them. An additional part of his salvific work is highlighted in Hebrews chapters 2, verses 14 and 15. Jesus has liberated his siblings from the power of one of the very angelic beings over whom he has now been exalted, the malevolent angel known as the devil. Let me now read Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. This is where we delve into the book of Jubilees. The Jubilees account of Moses' deliverance of Israel from Egypt in terms of the people's liberation from the malevolent angelic being known as Mastema, who was identified with Satan, offers some highly illuminating parallels to aspect of Hebrews' argument that help make sense of the author's claim about Jesus' defeat of the devil in the passage here. So what in the world is Jubilees? The Jewish concept of the Jubilee year, known in Hebrew as Yovel, is a fascinating and complex idea with roots in the Torah. It represents a time of restoration, liberation, and renewal for both individuals and the land. The Jubilee year is described in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. It was to be observed every 50 years, following 7 cycles of sabbatical years, which occur every 7 years. What are the observances for this Jubilee year? The first is land restoration. The land was to lie fallow, just as in the sabbatical year. No sowing or reaping was allowed, and people were to rely on what they grew naturally. This allowed the land to rest and replenish. Second is the return of property. All land that had been sold or mortgaged during the previous 50 years was to be returned to its original owner of their families. This aimed to prevent the accumulation of land in the hands of a few and maintain a more equitable distribution of resources. Next was the release of servants. Hebrew slaves were to be freed. This provided an opportunity for those who had fallen into servitude due to debt or poverty to regain their freedom and reintegrate into society. Next was a proclamation of liberty. The Jubilee year was announced by the blowing of a ram's horn on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, symbolizing a time of liberation and forgiveness. So what is the purpose and significance of the Jubilee year? First, social justice. The Jubilee year aimed to address economic inequality and prevent the concentration of wealth and power. It provided a reset for society, allowing people to start anew and have a fresh chance. Second is spiritual renewal. The Jubilee year was a time for reflection, repentance, and reconciliation. It emphasized the importance of community, compassion, and living in accordance with God's laws. Finally is connection to the land. The land was seen as a sacred trust, and the Jubilee year emphasized the importance of respecting and caring for it. The fallowing of the land allowed it to rest and regenerate, ensuring its long-term fertility. The historical context of this is while the specific practices of the Jubilee year may not be fully observed today, the concept remains an important part of Jewish tradition and thought. It serves as a reminder of the ideas of social justice, economic equality, and the importance of caring for the land. So there is a modern relevance here. The concept of the Jubilee year has inspired movements and initiatives aimed at addressing issues such as debt relief, economic inequality, and environmental sustainability. It serves as a powerful symbol of hope for a more just and equitable world. Jubilees provides valuable information about Jewish beliefs and practices during the Second Temple period. This is roughly 515 BC to 70 CE, about 600 years. This era is crucial for understanding the background of early Christianity, as Jesus and his followers were Jewish and lived within this context. Some early Christian writers were familiar with Jubilees and referenced it in their own writings. This suggests that Jubilees was an important text for some early Christian writers, even if it wasn't included in the canon. In summary, the Jubilee year is a profound concept that embodies the Jewish values of social justice, economic balance, and the sanctity of the land. It serves as a reminder of our responsibility to care for one another and the earth, and to strive for a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. The author of the Book of Jubilees is unknown. However, some believe the author was a member of the Qumran community, which was made up of Essenes. The Book of Jubilees is also known as the Little Genesis and also as the Apocalypse of Moses. The book is written in Hebrew and is thought to have been written during the reign of John Hyrcanus, which would be about 135 BC to 105 BC. The Book of Jubilees is an ancient Jewish text that retells the stories from the book of Genesis and the first part of Exodus. It adds extra details and organizes that history into 49-year periods called Jubilees. Here's a breakdown of what you'll find in the Book of Jubilees. First, a rewritten Genesis. It covers the same events as Genesis, but with some differences and additions. For example, it mentions the names of Adam and Eve's daughters and describes the creation of angels. The book divides time into 49-year cycles called Jubilees, giving a specific timeline for events from the creation to Moses. Angels and demons. Jubilees talks about angels, including fallen angels, who mated with humans and created giants. It also discusses the role of demons in influencing people. It has laws and festivals. It emphasizes the importance of following God's law, including those about the Sabbath, festivals, and circumcision. It claims these were observed even before the time of Moses. Although Jubilees doesn't explicitly mention a Messiah in the same way the New Testament does, it reflects a hope for God's intervention in the history and the restoration of Israel. This messianic expectation was a key element of the religious context in which Christianity emerged. The book promotes a 364-day calendar, different from the lunar calendar used in some Jewish traditions. Lastly, the Hebrew language. It suggests that Hebrew was the original language spoken by everyone, but was forgotten after the Tower of Babel. Here are some interesting side notes. The Book of Jubilees is not part of the canon of the Bible for most Jewish and Christian denominations. However, it is considered sacred by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as well as Ethiopian Jews. It's considered part of the Pseudepigrapha, a collection of ancient Jewish religious texts outside the biblical canon. The Dead Sea Scrolls include fragments of Jubilees, showing it was an important text for some Jewish groups in the Second Temple period. The Book of Jubilees offers a window into the religious and cultural landscape of the Second Temple period, which is essential for understanding the origins of Christianity. While it is not part of the Christian Bible, it shares some ideas and concepts with early Christian writings and provides valuable historical context. However, there are also significant differences, particularly in its emphasis on law and its unique calendar system. So what does Jubilees have to do with respect to the letter to the Hebrews? I'll start with a quote from Jubilees. All the powers of Mastema have been let loose to slay all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. In Jubilees, the main enemy of God and his people is Mastema, the chief of the spirits. Mastema, in other words, is the powerful evil angel known in biblical texts as Satan. He is the accusing spirit who seeks to lead humanity to destruction and to test and tempt God's people. He also holds sway over a host of other demons, other malevolent angels who have rebelled against God. Jubilees chapter 48 and 49 retells the story of Israel's exodus from Egypt at the first Passover. These chapters focus on aspects of Exodus 2 and 4 and 7 through 14. Mastema initially attempted to thwart Israel's liberation from Egypt by trying to kill Moses when he returned to Egypt from Midian. After Moses led the people out of Egypt, it was Mastema who hardened the Egyptians' heart and made them stubborn, so that they pursued the fleeing Israelites. Jubilees also states that as the people of Israel were eating the Passover in Egypt, all the powers of Mastema had been let loose to slay all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the captive maidservant, and to even the cattle. Mastema's forces were, however, prevented from entering any house on the door frames of which they saw the blood of the Lamb, having to pass by it, so that all those that were in the house should be saved because the sign of the blood was on their door frames. The identification in Jubilees, both of Mastema as the evil power at work within Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and of Mastema's demonic minions as the agents who struck down the firstborn during the night of the first Passover, are remarkable when compared with the account in Exodus itself. This means that in Jubilees, the Exodus is far more than a showdown between Pharaoh and Moses, who is backed by Israel's God. By identifying Mastema, whom Jubilees also refers to as an evil destroyer, in play behind the scenes. Jubilees has recast the story of Israel's exodus in terms of a larger battle between Israel's God and Moses on one side, and Satan, who seeks to accuse and destroy Israel itself and Pharaoh on the other. Moses' liberation of Israel was, in other words, as much a kind of defeat of Mastema, the destroyer, as it was a freeing of the people from Egyptian enslavement. Jubilees does not imagine Mastema as a fully independent agent of evil doing whatever he pleases to foil and hinder God's purposes. Clearly, Mastema seeks to keep Israel in slavery. Clearly, too, he hardens Pharaoh's heart and impels the Egyptians to pursue Israel after they are liberated. This is significant for reading Hebrews chapter 2. Jubilees demonstrates the existence of a Jewish interpretive tradition that understood the Exodus to be as much about the liberation of God's people from the power of Mastema, the satanic destroyer, as it was about being freed from Pharaoh and the Egyptians. I quote from Hebrews chapter 2. by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. Hebrews only explicitly refers to the first Passover once, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 28. The author speaks of Moses faithfully keeping the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Yet Hebrews' reference to the destroyer of Exodus 12:23 as the agent who struck down the firstborn at the first Passover is telling. In the light of Jubilees, together with a number of other texts and Jewish traditions about Satan and the angel of death, it appears that Hebrews envisions the first Passover in terms of Moses' liberation of Israel from the malevolent angel who killed the firstborn. This evil spirit who seeks to enslave and destroy humanity is, moreover, the evil angel whom Jesus fully defeated, the devil. I quote now from Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. It reads, "Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death." That Jesus' defeat of the devil here recalls Moses' liberation of God's people at the first Passover from the destroyer, the malevolent angelic figure Jubilees calls Mastema, can be seen from the fact that Hebrews' opening chapters draw heavily on the larger Exodus narrative. Hebrews connects Jesus' defeat of the devil with liberation from the enslavement to the fear of death. The fact that the writer of the letter to the Hebrews moves on in chapters 3 and 4 to speak about Moses, the one who led God's people out of Egypt, and to compare readers to Israel in the wilderness, the very place Israel was after being freed from Egypt. The facts all support the conclusion that the author of Hebrews was intentionally working with the story of the Exodus and the liberation of God's people from enslavement when he spoke about Jesus' defeat of the devil and liberation of his followers from the enslaving fear of the power of death. Moses faced off against the destroyer when he performed the first Passover and led God's people safely out of bondage in Egypt. This is referred to in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 28. Jubilees offers a vivid account of this liberation in terms of a spiritual battle, clearly indicating that some Jews understood the destroyer of Exodus 12, verse 23, to be the devil and his demons. Hebrews plays on this tradition of the devil as the true enslaver to show that when Jesus, the incarnate Son of God, died and rose again, the ultimate Passover and liberation of God's people occurred. To summarize, Jesus as high priest finally and fully liberated his siblings from the power of their age-old enemy. By his death and resurrection, he has defeated the devil himself. Now as the exalted human being, crowned with glory and honor, this from Hebrews 2, verse 9, Jesus rules even over the angels who must worship him. Satan, the great tempter and accuser of God's people, has been defeated and put in his proper place.